Hi everyone. Sorry. This is the PowerPoint for Australopithecines and Paranthropines, in case you're wondering how to say that. You know, luckily we're not in class and you don't have to, I'm not going to ask you to pronounce it or something. Okay, so we're going to get started. We'll get right into this one. So hopefully you have this pulled up. We'll go right into it. Slide 2. So in your book, I'd have to double check, but I know in the past, because I think we just switched books, so I don't know if they changed this part of it from like last year's edition. This year's they might have, but or regardless of that, whether you are looking at an older textbook or even like reading an older paper or something, that how we kind of named these two groups has slightly changed. So it used to be that this group we're going to talk about, which is multiple species, people used to think that they all belonged to the same genus, and we called that genus Australopithecus. And so every species that was in that genus was, Australopithecus, blah, 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 Australopithecus, blah, blah, blah. And then as, more evidence was found over time, and paleoanthropologists started to realize, well, okay, it looks like we're seeing, similar adaptive niches in some aspects, but some really different ones in other aspects. They're clearly closely related, but still clear morphological differences. It seems as if these groups, which we used to kind of put all under the genus of Australopithecus, it seems as if we should probably split them. And they had been thinking about this for a while because, and this is the point I was going to get to with some of the, if you're looking at like an older textbook or an older, like a science paper, that they already kind of thought they were different in that they would call one of the groups the gracile Australopithecines and the other group the robust Australopithecines. Now, because we recognize in paleoanthropology, we recognize they are clearly two separate genera. The ones that used to be considered the gracile Australopithecines have retained that name, Australopithecus, and the ones who used to be considered the robust Australopithecines, we now call the Paranthropines. Their genus is Paranthropus, so it's Australopithecus and Paranthropus. Hopefully that's clear to you guys. Okay, slide 3. And I'll have multiple pictures like this, like I made them, just because I think I've mentioned this to you guys before. Like for myself, I like to have a very good visual, like in terms of like timeline. I'm like, I like to have a visual of representing it in some way. So this is just kind of useful. I wished when I took this class that someone had made some simple charts, because sometimes the charts in the book, I'm like, what's going on? Because when you're starting an introductory course, you're not really sure how to understand some of the the way like the evolutionary trees or cladograms, and so something simple like this I think is useful. Anyway, so just as a reminder, we talked in the previous PowerPoint about the early genera. We talked very briefly about them, and now we're moving into this other group, the Australopithecines and Paranthropines. As you can see based on the picture, like there's a lot of branching events and stuff happening, a lot of stuff happening around this time. We have a lot of evidence too for this. So this is in contrast to what I said before about the early genera where we didn't have as much. Now we have like just hundreds, thousands of specimens. Okay, so slide 4. As we talk about these different species, I'm going to talk briefly about a few of these species. There's there's one thing I want you to understand, and here it is right here in bold, in larger font, underlined, that the main differences between these two groups, the Australopithecines and Paranthropines, has to do with their diet. That's the main difference. Because you might even hear like I have here listed, gracile features or robust features. That doesn't have anything to do with like that one's really tall and one's really small, or one's very wide and one's not. That's not. From the neck down, some small differences I'll talk about, but essentially the same. Same height, brain size was the same. The only difference is their diet was insanely different. So we see these giant differences in their jaw, their teeth, the muscles of mastication, and how that changes the shape of the skull. So it's all about the diet. And you can see based on these two like small charts, brain size is about the same from the evidence we have. But it's everything else. So those for the graciles, like their teeth are still like moderate size, but for what we see for the robust or for the Paranthropines, the teeth are just massive. I'll show you some pictures. The teeth really are the huge difference. The skull, features of the skull where muscles are attaching are going to be extreme for the Paranthropines versus for the Australopithecines, they're not. So I have some pictures coming up, but just know, like if I said, what is the main difference between Australopithecines and Paranthropines, you would be able to tell me diet. And then of course, as we go into in a minute, you'll know like specifically what that means, but diet, what they were eating was the main difference between these two groups. And it changed a lot about who they were morphologically. Okay, so go to slide 5. And you can see here, I know this isn't the best picture, but it has them all in one photo. These handful of features that I've listed in the bullet points. Don't stress too much about, luckily the nice thing about having the online class is that when you have the exam, you have time to sit there, so you don't have to necessarily memorize anything. But still, like, these are important features, and there are more, but these are the ones I wanted to point out to you. These are some of the main regions where there's some massive difference between the Australopithecines and the Paranthropines. So the first one, the zygomatico-temporal space. So if you look at the top photo, you can see like the Australopithecus compared to the Paranthropus. And if you're looking down, because it's like a top-down view, you see like right on the side there's those holes, right? So you have this bone right here, your zygomatic bone, and you have the zygomatic arch, and you have a muscle that sits behind it, your temporalis muscle, and that comes up and attaches up here. On humans it attaches like somewhere right around here, but for other animals, when that muscle's bigger, it kind of attaches farther up, and sometimes that muscle is so big that it actually causes zygomatic to like expand out a little bit because you have to fit all that muscle back there. So there is a lot of chewing going on for these animals, and you can see for the Australopithecine that the space is like medium size. It's like you could see it, but that space is much larger for the Paranthropus. It means that muscle is much larger. So we already know before we even look at like the teeth or the jaw that muscle of mastication is quite larger. The next feature is sagittal crest. So if you look at the second picture down, it's showing this like kind of ridge of bone on the Paranthropine, and for the Australopithecine, we don't see that. Basically, for that temporalis muscle, sometimes that muscle is so large and your head doesn't have enough bone for it to attach to. Basically, the body creates a ridge of an extra bone so that muscle can attach. So we see that feature with the Paranthropines, and we don't see that feature with the Australopithecines. Mandible size, the next one. So of course, like, mandibles are massive. You can see that in the picture comparing, Australopithecus versus Paranthropus, like in that third picture down. And it's not as if the Australopithecus jaw compared to like a human jaw, for example, is like the same size. It's not. Like it's clearly larger. We would consider like, moderate, but the Paranthropus one is just, it's taller, it's wider, just everything about it is bigger. And then of course I mentioned the zygomatic already, and then of course the teeth. And this picture doesn't really do it justice. Like the teeth, I have a couple better pictures here in a minute of the Paranthropus teeth are just like, they are massive, massive. And remember, for a primate, if you want to know what they're eating, you look at the back teeth, you look at the molars and the premolars, right? Okay. Slide 6. Okay, so now I'm going to talk very briefly about, well, not very briefly, but moderately briefly, about these species. There are more than this, but I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. I have like a slide or two for each of them. So the Australopithecines. So go to slide 7, talk about the first one briefly. Australopithecus anamensis. You can see here some of the first fossils that were found for this individual, and at this point, we know based on the shape of the tibia and some other stuff that it's clearly a biped, like no doubt at this point, clearly bipedal. We're still seeing moderate-sized teeth, and evidence is indicating maybe still a slightly divergent hallux, the big toe. But remember that being bipedal, it's not as if suddenly within like a generation your toe is going to be in line with the rest of your big toe is going to be in line with the rest of them. There's going to be a process. So while we still might see features of like more ancestral, it doesn't indicate that individual was not, or that group was not bipedal. In fact, the evidence is pointing to that they were. They probably just still had some of these other ancestral features. Okay, go to slide 8. The next one, which we have so much information about, Australopithecus afarensis. There's a very famous specimen that was found called Lucy. You might have heard of her. She was Australopithecus afarensis. And in fact, when I was in Ethiopia and I was working at the museum, everyone there calls it the Lucy Museum because they have her there. And when people would ask like, oh, well, you know, are you here? Are you tourists? Are you traveling? Like, no, we work at the museum. Oh, the Lucy Museum. Like, yes, the Lucy Museum. So she's like, you know, like a national treasure. It's very cool. And then, like I said, here it's just a chart of showing you like kind of where we're at. But multiple locations where we found specimens for the species, you know, so many. You can see here's some of the number of the species, you know, and then if you go to slide 9, you can see Lucy. So you can see the actual bones. But in the picture, you can see Australopithecus afarensis compared to like a Homo sapien. And you can see like there are some clear similarities, but some clear differences as well. So clearly bipedal, but not the same stature. Now, there's not a goal in evolution to make someone taller. That's not necessarily a thing. But we do know when we look at our lineage, we see that we got taller over time, interestingly. So at least if we're comparing them, not that there's a goal towards height of any, you know, particular height, but we can still kind of compare like, oh, they weren't quite as tall then, here we're taller. That's interesting to see, you know, note the comparing and contrasting. So you can still see like clearly like the height difference is fairly extreme. And the brain size for, I think I have it coming up on a slide, the brain size for afarensis is increasing a little bit, but it's not, I mean, like a huge increase. Go to the next slide. Another example, some famous fossilized footprints called the Laetoli footprints. So these were preserved. There's been a lot of hypotheses about this, like, oh, it was a mom and a dad and a kid. It's a very romanticized idea of what was going on. You know, we might be able to tell there were 3 individuals. We might even be able to tell, like, maybe one of them was a juvenile, and we know they were bipedal. But there's no way to really, like, know anything else about their social structure, just based on the footprints. Like I said, don't overly romanticize anything about any of this, whether it's, you know, afarensis or when we talk about Homo sapiens. Like, okay, go to slide 11. And just a little bit more on afarensis. So you can see the brain size is a little bigger. We're seeing a slight increase, but it's still fairly small. It's not much bigger. Like a modern chimpanzee is around 350 cc's. So we see the teeth getting smaller. So we're seeing that trend in our lineage. Teeth are getting smaller, especially the canine. That we don't have that honing complex, that we've lost that a long time ago. And it's this individual based on, you know, Lucy, but also many of the other specimens, but like hundreds of specimens. Clearly bipedal, multiple points of anatomical morphological evidence to support that. So we're seeing them walking on 2 limbs, no doubt. But there are a couple of interesting things going on with them. So those last 4 bullet points at the bottom, you can see, and you can kind of see this in the picture too. There's some interesting features to afarensis. They have what's called a funnel-shaped thorax. So look at the rib cage. So that could be indicative of, and what the gut length, lung capacity, like it's probably has to do with like the gut system. And so like when you look at animals whose diet consists mostly of plants, we tend to see a slightly larger gut system, and this would make sense for afarensis. This is what they were eating, plant eaters. We don't see any meat eating in the human lineage until very recently, so all eating plants. And also the arms are a bit long and the fingers are a bit long, which could still indicate either it's just an ancestral feature that they haven't lost, or if they're still using it, like maybe they're walking bipedally at times and also maybe living in the trees at times too. That would totally make sense. And then you can see here this really great Smithsonian recreation they did of, you know, based on the skulls that they had of what you know, the species would have looked like. So it's still looking fairly ancestral, but you know, like, I mean, when I look at it, I clearly see something in our lineage. It looks very similar to humans. It just slight differences, you know. Go to slide 12, more on afarensis. And just like I had this multiple times in this PowerPoint, you can just kind of see like the ancestral versus derived or new features. So still a little prognathic. You know, like I said before, the longer upper limbs, the fingers, but clearly these new derived features. Thick enamel, the placement of the foramen magnum, and the other features indicating that it's definitely a biped. Okay. Slide 13. Australopithecus africanus. So here we have the very first one found. This specimen's called Tong, or Tong child, or the Tong baby. I'm probably saying that wrong. What was I gonna say? There's something else I was gonna say. I don't want to get far ahead of myself because I think it comes up in a. Oh yeah, I remember. So Tong was the first Australopithecine ever found by someone named Raymond Dart, and I have this coming up in a second. But just note that in your mind, it was the very first one found. But also on this, still on slide 13, the very last point is, you see it says something called Endocast. Basically, that's a fossilized brain. So if you look at this fossil, you can see that what looks to be a fossilized brain. This happens on occasion. It depends on how it's preserved and the sediments, and we've had this happen a few times with a few different species in our lineage. And it can tell us something about lobe, brain lobe, size, separation, like areas. So it's not like having the real brain, but it gives us more information than we had. So this can be important, especially when we're talking about our lineage and thinking about, okay, well, like for example, did the regions of speech comprehension get bigger, or were they not big yet? Like, you know what I mean? So it just gives us another line of inquiry evidence. Okay, so slide 14, Raymond Dart. So Raymond Dart was, he discovered this very first Australopithecine, Tong, and so this was in the 1920s, and unfortunately, I think, and that you could see him there in that picture with the specimen. He's very young, you know, full of excitement about science, and then, you know, shit happens. If you go to slide 15, you'll see him, and you'll see some more details. So he was an anatomist, an anthropologist. He was working in South Africa, and it was a colleague who had, I think, had been given a fossil like from a friend who worked like in a local like rock quarry, and they thought it was just like the skull of like a baboon. But they thought, oh, like this is cool. You know, the local professor might want it for like anatomy class or whatever. And he got it and was like, this is something different. This is not a baboon. It's not a quadruped. This is a biped. And based on some other stuff, he's like, this looks like, I think this is something in our lineage. And this is an important point that's going to come up a few times in these PowerPoints for this section. Is that I'm like, this is really important as I blink. A lot of these scientists know they didn't know what they were going to find. Like when we look at like all that we have, all the specimens and fossils we have for hominins, we're like, oh, clearly the picture is this. Like we know like 80% of it, or we're pretty confident in most of it. But imagine you didn't have any fossils. Imagine you're a scientist. You're like, okay, humans evolved from something. We're probably related to chimps. Makes the most sense. When did we split with them? I don't know. What did we look like at the beginning? I don't know. Like, I didn't know. And it's not one's fault, you know. But of course, they started to hypothesize, like, well, we probably look like this, or these were probably the features that were important. And so as a lot of these, you know, well, for the most part, you know, white European men hypothesizing about this, they got most of it wrong. What they thought they would see was, well, one, their biases of the time. They thought, okay, thinking of humans, in their minds, they were like, who are the best humans? So like, well, obviously Europeans are the best. So they thought they would find a lot of human evolution happening in Europe. Well, that's wrong. Most of it happens in Africa. It's only until very recently that it happens in Europe a little bit. So they were wrong about that. And they also thought, okay, what's a thing that separates humans from other animals? It's our big brains, it's our intelligence. So what they thought they'd see is big brains being a defining feature for multiple species in our lineage. In fact, you know, that's wrong as well. Big brains, our brains are a little bigger, but they don't really get big until very recently. So they were wrong about that. So in their minds, what they're thinking they're going to find when they start finding fossils, because they're convinced they're going to find them eventually, like they're digging and stuff, they're thinking, we're going to find a lot of stuff in Europe, and we're going to find a lot of big brain, like things that what they think they're going to see is something that kind of has like an ape body, but with a big brain. And in fact, we know it's the opposite. is what we actually see in human evolution is like, you know, bipedalism, modern height and stature, modern body size, and then brains jump. It's complete opposite of what. So as people like Raymond Dart and some other scientists are finding fossils, they're like, hey, this is a biped. The brain's a little big. I think this might be something in our lineage. They were like, nope, disregard, can't be. And so this happened, unfortunately, with not just Raymond Dart, but with a few other people. I think that'll come up in this this section too. That you know, based on these biases of these scientists, you know, we missed out on, you know, decades of really great research. Eventually, you know, we like now, but even not too long after this, people realized these amazing finds for what they were. But it took like, you know, like 30 years for them to be like, oh shit, sorry, we were wrong. That was actually really important, and we've been wasting 3 decades, you know, not looking at it. But very important find. Go to slide 16, and you'll see just a close up of that. Like I said, you know, the Endocast, and Dart, of course, noticed that the sections of the brain. He, you know, recognized that it was bipedal. And if you look at the, it's not very prognathic, but it's also juvenile. So I mean, even if you look like at a modern chimp infant, like they're fairly flat faced. It's not till later that the feature kind of arises. But he was like convinced, you know, and he was correct. Dart was that this was clearly something in our ancestry. Well, not in our direct lineage. Maybe he didn't know yes or no to that, but he knew it was something, you know, in our lineage to some degree. So go to slide 17. Like, I just got ahead of myself. I just said all this. So his claims were disregarded, blah, blah, blah. They did not think they would find anything in Africa. Like, they were, you know, of course, horribly biased and racist about this. We're not going to find anything in Africa. In fact, we know, like, the majority of it's in Africa. So they were wrong about that. They thought big brains would be developed first. We know that was, like, one of the last things. Like, brains are getting a little bigger, like I said, but we don't see this huge jump in, like, a modern kind of brain size until very recently, in our lineage. Okay, slide 18. And then just another visual just so you kind of see the timeline of this. Like, this is, I'm oversimplifying this, but for the purposes of this class, you just kind of understand it in this sense. Trust me, it's very complicated. Okay, slide 19. A little more on Africanus. So here we have some more specimens. Here we have an adult specimen. This was Mrs. Ples, a very famous specimen. That skull right there. Multiple sites where we found, you know, this species, and you can see here this great Smithsonian recreation again. Brains a little bigger, but still kind of looks, you know, ancestral. Like, you would say that looks probably more like a chimp, but also remember, like, this is a fully bipedal animal with a slightly bigger brain and a little bit, you know, less prognathism, and the teeth. Like, that's not chimp teeth. That's like a very human, like, you know, dentition. Look at that smile. Okay. So the molars are not very big. The anterior teeth, so these teeth in front, are a bit large, you know, moderate to large. And they have this really unique feature called anterior pillars. It's kind of hard to see on this one photo I have on the skull, but it's basically this ridge of bone kind of along the side of the nose to, like, down here to the teeth. And there's been a lot of research into, like, what this feature does. Does it help with, like, chewing? Does it help with, like, strengthening something? Is it a lot of research? But just know that it's unique. It's a unique facial morphological feature to them. Okay, so slide 20. I'm sorry, I should have had a little slide between that to give you guys a heads up that now we're going to be talking about the Paranthropines. I must have forgot to include that. Okay, so we talked about the 3 Australopithecines. Now we're going to talk about the 3 Paranthropus species, the ones that I have up here. Okay, so the first one's Paranthropus Ethiopicus. Like I said, you know, just for your reference, the time and location. So go to slide 21 and you'll see the type specimen. So it's been nicknamed the black skull. Look at it. This was because, you know, when it was pulled out of the ground, it had been dyed black because of the sediment, the soil, and so it was given this nickname, black skull. Very robust. So here you can see, like, there's no teeth. and there's no mandible. But based on like, if you know anything about like anatomy morphology, if you know where like the like the mandibular fossa are like in the temporal bone, you'll know like, okay, that's where it's going to attach based on like the length of they can guesstimate like what the jaw would actually look like, and because how like all mammal anatomy works. But anyway, so like, but we only have that, the top part of the face, but they can still tell so much. Those zygomatics are very flared out. That giant crest recall those the temporalis muscles. So we know like there's something going on that's very different in this species than what we had seen with the other ones, that the muscles for mastication are huge, which is indicating something about their diet. So this is the trend we see with these individuals. So if you go to slide 22, you'll see like, so the Paranthropines are like an evolutionary offshoot. Now I have here, it kind of looks like we've got Africanus there maybe with Afarensis. I'll just tell you, there's a lot of debate about this. I'm not going to ask you, describe in detail which one came from which and draw a chart. Like, I'm not going to ask you, like, because in fact, there is still currently debate in our field about some of these like branching events, like exactly who and when and what makes the most sense morphologically. And just know, like, we might say, oh, we kind of all agree sort of on this point or this point. There are still some points of debate about it. So don't I'm not going to ask you to like fill in this chart. I'm not going to ask you that. But just know this group in general, Paranthropines, are an evolutionary offshoot. Okay, go to slide 23 and you will see some more details about this group, Paranthropus. So here we have Paranthropus, the second one, Paranthropus robustus, and this great Smithsonian recreation, looking fairly ancestral still. So this group is not in our direct lineage though. They're like an evolutionary offshoot from in our line though. But you can see that skull, the type specimen for it. It also has kind of a partial endocast, but the back part of the skull is kind of missing. But you can see what would have been the beginning of that crest, and we can, mathematically we could say, okay, it probably would have been about like such and such big. Oh baby, you need help? You got it? Oh, come here. Come on. Why don't you sit right here for a second, okay? Okay, good girl. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so here we see the teeth are massive. Everything about the teeth, the molars, the premolars are getting really big, but the front teeth are small. Like, they're not really using them for anything. So those teeth in the front, not very big. But those back teeth are huge, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. And then of course we have those zygomatics are flaring out. And you can see that in that Smithsonian recreation that they have like their faces, like right here especially, are just really flared out because they have to fit that giant muscle behind there, right? And go to slide 24, another chart, don't even worry about that. Okay, slide 25. And then the third one in this group, Paranthropus Bosei. So you can see here, this is a cast, but you can see the, from the side, that sagittal crest for that muscle attachment, that giant mandible. Even the teeth you can still see in that cast from the side. You're like, whoa, giant teeth. Basically, everything in Bosei is just an extreme version of what we see in Robustus. Everything's big. And look at that Smithsonian recreation. Look at those zygomatics. Those zygomatics are like way the hell out here for that giant muscle behind. Like, and those teeth, that mandible is just a chewing machine. Imagine basically a bipedal cow, like chewing and gnawing and eating. Like, there's some debate about what they were eating. Was it something really hard? Was it something very fibrous that they had to chew and chew and chew? So, but they're doing a lot of chewing. Oh baby. And they need these giant back teeth to do it. So go to slide 26, and I want to show you this one thing that was a bullet point on the last one, postorbital constriction, just to point out what that is. So here you can see Homo sapiens. I have the top-down view of the skull, the side view, and then of course the side view of what the where the temporalis muscle is. Now you can see, like, on the side view where the temporalis muscle is, like for chewing, that it's attaching to the mandible and it's coming up here on the side of the head. Like, ours isn't very big. But like when you see someone chewing, you're like, oh, I can see like this muscle moving right here when they're chewing. But if you look at the top-down view of the human skull, you see like our zygomatics, because that muscle's so not even very big, that our zygomatic bone, if you're looking top-down, you don't really see it extended out at all. Like if you were to tilt the skull, you'd maybe see a little bit. But just from a direct top-down, that zygomatic's just kind of fairly flush with the skull. Like there's only a small space for the muscle because our muscle's small. Compare that to, and this is the point of this, the other hominins. So here we have like Bosei, some like looks like a Ethiopicus and an Australopithecine. But look at that giant space for that muscle, that temporalis muscle. Like that space is enormous. But also, and this is the point of this, look what it does to the shape of the brain. So for humans, if you look at our, like from the top down, we have a nice kind of oval shape. Now there's other reasons for that, so this is a very general comparison. But because that space or that muscle, there's, it's not really interfering with anything. Look at, for that very first example, that's a paranthropine for sure. That giant space for that muscle, and look at the shape of the head, where the eyes would be in the front, like this. And I want to point to it, but I can't point to it because you don't know what I'm pointing to. Like, if we're looking, like, for like a human, it's like, okay, here's like the shape of the head from the top, right? That's a horrible picture. You guys know what I'm saying. But for the other one, it's like pinched in, which we call constriction. It's pinched in so much from that muscle that you went from something, theirs might have been a little different, something generally like oval, to now like this. That's the shape of their head from the top down. Do you see that? Because that bone on the outside, so that muscle can fit in right here. So the shape of the head is literally like pinched. It's pinched in behind the eyes. Like their eyes are like separate from the rest of their head. Like really look at that photo. It's really weird. Which shows you like there was probably selection against them getting a bigger brain, possibly. Because, well, one, it might not have mattered, having high intelligence or higher cognition or a larger brain isn't always adaptive. But also, they were like, eating this particular food all the time and chewing and chewing and chewing is so important and vital to our survival, we're going to sacrifice other stuff. Hopefully that makes sense to you, but I just want you to visually see that. It's like crazy. It's crazy. Okay. Slide 27, another photo. Too many of these. Just kind of showing you the offshoot, but here's the cool picture, slide 28. Look, this is showing Paranthropus Bosei compared to a modern Homo sapien. Now look at the front teeth. Not that much difference, right? But look at those back teeth. Look at those molars. Look at the back of the human molar. Like, how many could you fit in that Paranthropine molar? Like 6 or 7? That thing is huge. Like, huge. Huge. Okay, and then slide 29 is just a chart. Like, you don't need to know that. Okay, so hopefully you got a lot out of this one, and a lot of cool stuff, a lot of cool morphological stuff. And I will see you guys on the next one.